Meie järgmine esineja tuleb meile ka üle videosilla Londonist. Tema nimi on Berkay Özcan, ma väga vabandan, kui ma hääldan seda pisut valesti. Tema on professor, kes töötab London School of Economics institutsioonis ja tema kohta ma võiks öelda seda, et ta tegeleb pere- ja võrdsuspoliitikatega majandus perspektiivist. Ta uurib võrdsuspoliitikat ja pereprotsesside mõju ehk lahutuse ja majandusliku seisukorra mõju laste heaolule. Tema ettekande nimi on Family Policies, Parental Separation and Children's Outcomes. Tema ettekanne on inglise keeles. Loodame, et kõik on meile arusaadav, aga kui tekib küsimusi, siis Berkay Özcanile, et võib-olla mõnda kohta, et ta võiks täpsustada, et siis kindlasti kirjutage need küsimused YouTube'i chati, sest pärast ettekannet on meil ka väike küsimuste ja vastuste voor. Jah, vastuseks ühele küsijale meie tänane konverents on järelvaadatav ja kuulatav. Aga anname siis sõna praegu Berkay Özcanile, professorile, kes tegutseb London School of Economicsis.
Hello, my name is Berkay Özcan, and I'm an associate professor at the London School of Economics in the Department of Social Policy and the School of Public Policy. I want to say thank you very much for inviting me to this conference and in front of the Estonian audience. I wish I had been there in person and get a chance to meet with everyone individually, but I'm extremely honored and humbled to be among distinguished speakers and talk about my recent research about family policies, parental separations, and children's outcomes. Let me go straight away to the presentation. Divorce rates have been stabilized in the last 30 years, almost all European countries, although Southern European countries have exhibited some sort of increase in trends, and then there's this discussion of greater convergence across Europe. If you look at the line about Estonia, you see the greater decline happened already in the mid-90s and onwards, and there is this mid-level divorce rates happening for most of the continental European countries. These divorce rates, even though they have been stabilized over time, and on average, they're a lot higher than where they used to be for a majority of the countries when we compare them in the middle of the 20th century. If you look at one of the most recent data sets across the European map, where you can see there are some countries where there's high divorce rates and as well as high marriage rates, and some countries where there's low marriage rates and high divorce rates, and vice versa. And Estonia is not too bad in the combination of high marriage and high divorce rates compared to Latvia and Lithuania, the neighboring countries. Still in the camp of the countries where there is this number of divorcees per 1,000 people are on the high end, as well as the number of marriage rates is also on the higher end. And so it's kind of a high divorce, high marriage, as well as high cohabitation country group. Why does this matter? It matters because there are some particularities about the divorce and separation trends across Europe. One of them is the fact that proportion of parents who are separated or divorced have gone up dramatically over the 40 years across the OECD countries. I don't have Estonia in this data set because it comes from the World Value Survey, which is one of the long-running surveys about divorce and marriage across globally. But we can see in the majority of the countries from mid-80s to mid-90s to mid-2000s and 2010s, there's an increase of proportion of parents who are separated or divorced as opposed to non-parents. But I have another slide that shows Estonia particularly. It's a very unique country compared to other countries. Although my talk is not going to be about Estonia, I wanted to highlight some of the particularities about Estonia here, is that the share of divorcees that are parents among all divorcees is one of the largest in Estonia. Estonia have one of the highest rates of divorced and separated couples in the overall couples across the OECD countries. It's on the high end, but also among those couples where the share of divorces are also the largest. What does that mean? That means that basically children are more likely to be involved in parental divorce cases than in other countries compared in the OECD countries. So among the OECDs, when you look at one of the consequences of high divorce and high children involvement would be expecting a lot of single mothers or lone mothers, lone fathers, and then children growing up in households where there's only one parent living with a sole parent. Remarkably, Estonia is not one of those countries where this is the case. There are countries like UK, where I am based in, is where almost a quarter of children live in a household where there is only one parent. In Estonia, still, despite the high divorce rate, children living with two parents are quite large, a large proportion of the households. So given these global statistics to locate Estonia, the rest of my talk will be focusing on three different issues. One of them is divorce, separation, and then how does that relate to family structure changes in overall, and then we can observe well-being outcomes in children. In the second part of my talk, I'll be emphasizing how divorce and separation are related to women's work, and why it's important to have women's careers as the forefront of our focus when we discuss about family change, family structure change. And in the third part of my talk, I'll talk about the fathers' involvement and how policies can actually help in general. So my talk is about 25 to 28 minutes. So these are quite broad subjects. So I apologize if I go a bit superficial in some of the things that are becoming known by the mass public. What is not known is basically the relationship between divorce and parental, family changes, family structure changes on children's well-being and children's outcome is one of the most studied areas of research across various disciplines: psychology, sociology, economics, and demography. Because there's huge implications of family structure changes for welfare of individuals, especially for children, but as well as also for fathers and mothers. And David Rivar, an economist, had reviewed the literature in 2004 and had said that astonishingly vast literature. A search through the articles published since 1990s with the keywords children or divorce or family structure generated more than 1,100 citations by 2004. So when we look at since 2010, even in the last decade, there are multiple really large literature reviews in 2010 to 2013, 2014, 15, including that I contributed to one of those reviews, and 2020 recently. In each of these literature reviews that they reviewed the recent 80, 100, or 120 papers about how parental family structure changes influence the children's outcomes, and various outcomes have been looked at, from health to education to cognitive or socio-emotional well-being and behavior. So given the vast amount of research that is being produced about children's well-being and under family structure changes, what are some key findings? There are many findings, but the three of them I want to highlight in this particular talk. One of the things is basically what we know from this literature quite consistently across all of these studies, that children with absent fathers, be it due to divorce, separation, or sometimes fathers are absent at birth, have often worse outcomes than children that grow up with two married biological families. I'll come back to the quality of evidence, but these studies and literature reviews, they find consistent evidence that when we make these comparisons, on average, children grow up with absent fathers, they have worse outcomes on all of these outcomes, from health to education and others. Another key finding is that family transitions experienced in early ages and during adolescence have worse effects than those experienced in the middle childhood. What are early ages? Most likely between 0 to 6 years old, and during adolescence between 12 to 18 years old, depending on the outcome. compared to middle childhood between 7 to 12 years old. And growing, small but growing part of the literature also finds that frequent and positive contact with non-resident fathers improves outcomes in general. I wanted to highlight all three of these key findings, in addition to many other findings in these vast literature, because all three findings have different policy implications. We'll talk more about the policy implications later, but they do imply about how much contact and regulations can be arranged through the court processes, family offices, and so on during the divorce or marital separation when children are involved. Or think about like planning and timing of support through the welfare systems towards the children that are experiencing parental separation, and as well as trying to make sure that fathers' contact are ensured and like for children that are grown up in lone mother households, even if there's no divorce and separation happen, but the children are born to lone mother households, ends up getting necessary supports and adjustment from the welfare system. There are quite a lot of implications for policies, these findings, and I'll talk some of them as we go along the slides. But before moving that, I can imagine that there are a lot of eyebrows have been raised about the evidence quality and how, like, whether we can trust the evidence that are produced in this research. In the earlier literature review, David Rubar has criticized the studies that existed up to that point, heavily relying on associations based on cross-sectional small samples. But in 2013, Sarah McLennan from Princeton University and her colleagues have reviewed approximately 50 recent studies that are using longitudinal designs, which means that they are following children over time as well as their parents, and the studies that focused on establishing causation, which means whether the parental family breakup did cause the research by using various methodological strategies. And they find that across these different methods, the findings were consistent and robust, that the children ended up, like on average, showing worse outcomes when the fathers are not present. I say that like some people argue that whenever I present this research in front of an audience where people argue, is it better actually children to stay with a dysfunctional family rather than actually parents getting divorced so that the conflict within the family is resolved? Of course. So I'm not trying to say that the evidence says people should not be divorcing. It's on the contrary. The fact that the father is not being present had detrimental effect on the children's various outcomes, and this may be the average effect that we talk about, and then there might be differences into selection to marriage and divorce, even though some of these causal methods take into account the selection to marriage and divorce properly, some do not. So one needs to take into account the quality of the evidence with a grain of salt here. This is important, because I am also quite skeptical about some of the research that is produced in this vein. Although this is vast amount of studies produced, they are predominantly coming from the US data sets. Nearly 90% of these studies are heavily focused on the US, because US on any chart, they were at the highest divorce rates and much earlier, a couple of decades before. And then it was very much patterned by socioeconomic status more strongly than some of the European countries that we have observed. One of the other features of the US research is they often come with non-representative samples. There are very famous family studies, fragile families, national income of child, National Institute of Child and Health Development Studies, and so on. They are sampling low-income families where divorce is most likely to happen, and specific to the US, that race relations gets into too. And these data sets are collected predominantly throughout the 90s and early 2000s and 80s, where the children that we talk about are now quite well into their middle ages and adults. And the prevalence of different family forms are quite different in the US than compared to continental Europe. There's cohabitation, for example, in the US, which is understood more like a precursor to the marriage rather than an alternative to the marriage. Unlike Scandinavian countries, Estonia is one of them too, where high rates of cohabitation happens, and not always that cohabitation follows a marriage. and it becomes a stable marriage-like arrangement for children to grow healthily, very much like in a married couple, in Europe. And these notions are quite different in the US, where marriage is seen as a transitory, unstable, and the term as out of wedlock is more likely to be used for the US marriages. There is also a distinction about marriage in terms of legal marriages and connotations in the US research. So also the lack of family policies and welfare state support and social protection for children being very much limited on, like, with regards to children's development, makes the US quite an exceptional case. And like, I just wanted to highlight this in my talk, that we might be cautious about interpreting evidence coming from the US to translate them for policy reasons as quality evidence in the European contexts. One other thing is about understanding the quality, evidence quality for policy, is that the child outcomes and current family structures are typically measured quite difficult in data sets, because many children in now, like many of the advanced economies, experience multiple family transitions, and then there's no single treatment to think about child outcomes at certain stages. So we end up like comparing snapshots of pictures, where we take children at fixed ages, such as in this study that I show on the screen, where I have done with a bunch of colleagues, following a bunch of children who were born to lone mothers in the Millennium Cohort study in the UK, and then observe family transitions that they experienced at different stages. Some of them stayed continuously with their lone mothers, or some of them ended up like lone mothers getting married to someone else and experienced stepfather families. Other children have like been always continuously with two biological married parents, more traditionally. And then some of the children have experienced a lone mother, like born into a lone mother, and then the father joins in the family a few years later. Or some of them experience that father joining in the family, but then experience another divorce. So at different ages, we try to compare children's test scores, health behavior, growth, and other attitudes and like developmental measures. And by comparing children at different stages of their family trajectories, this is quite complex to think about it. So you need first ideal data set to follow a cohort of children to do that, and large enough to capture enough children in different parental family stages. So much of the research, when they think about family structure and family structure effects, they're actually talking about family structure trajectories, and the effects refer to either the destination of that trajectory or the origin of that trajectory. What do I mean by that? I mean that children start with some sort of family structure into their lives anyway. In this example, in the graph that I have, all the children started in their life, like into lone mother family households. And then they end up experiencing different family trajectories, and at different snapshot points, our comparisons becomes not for like, so to speak. So just to illustrate the example a bit better, many of us are familiar with Modern Family as an American TV show. I thought that it would illustrate my points more clearly here. If you are familiar with the TV show, there's this Latina woman who, like an immigrant who married to this older husband, Gloria married to Jay, and then she brought her child from the previous marriage, Manny, who's in the circle here. Let's call it the treatment child. And then she has another child from her current husband and this little guy here. And then this is the family of Gloria and Jay's and Manny's. And well, Jay has like a daughter who has a nuclear family, two married biological parent family, the Dunphys, and their children are all biological children. So this is a traditional biological family. And then Jay has another son who is in a same-sex relationship, Cameron, and then they're married, and then they have adopted children. I just want to illustrate this family configuration because typically the research focuses on Manny and compare Manny is a treatment child with the comparison group of the Dumfries children. So two married biological family children. So the average cognitive skills of these children are compared to average cognitive skills of many or people like many or children like many once the ages are constant. It is quite difficult to think about what, like from the Manny's perspective, what family structure changes that he has actually experienced. Is it the addition of the step parent or the family breakup in that setting or family relocation altogether? So there are multiple treatments that Manny has received, so it's very hard to isolate if there's any gap between Manny's average cognitive skills and the comparison group's Dunphy's like average skills that could be attributed to the experiences of family structure that Manny has. Either the step parents joining in the family or like an experience of a parental breakup. In some of the recent studies, especially in Scandinavia, with the availability of the register data sets, there are some models that compare about sibling fixed effects to understand the differences between Manny's performance compared to his brother's performance. And that's also a growing line of research. But there are all sorts of problems that you can see in terms of these comparisons to be made, rightly or wrongly so. And very little research compared to the amount of research that we covered in the two married biological parent families as well as blended step family configurations for the same-sex relationships and their adoptive daughter, Lily. And we know much less about them, and the right comparison group for those settings is hard to find. So the bottom line is the evidence that comes from this research is trying to compare children like for like, and then compare their cognitive behaviors, and then try to attribute these gaps and differences in cognitive, emotional, and health outcomes to some of those family structure changes, but it's a very hard task. And the second part of my talk will be focusing on the divorce, separation, and family structure changes with an emphasis on women and women's work. For much of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was this big debate about the divorce rates that were going up until the 1980s in the US, especially in the US, but also like with a 10 years delay in the UK, have highly correlated with the increased women's labor force participation in these countries and their employment and their career orientation. So this led like a number of researchers and the schools, following from the Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker and onwards, discussing whether women's work, like by making them more independent, by making them more career and market oriented, increase the divorce probability and risk in the families. And another sister question to this question was basically made the marriage an antiquated institution where women's work increased and the marriage became unnecessary from the Beckerian point of view, because gains from the marriage have been eroded over time because the women and men were doing similar functions rather than complementary functions. And then the other question is that people have been asking that there might be some reverse correlation, a causality here, whether the divorce probability, the increased divorce risk, have made women feel insecure in their marriages for their economic well-being. This has led women to participate more in the labor market and give more emphasis to their career or employment. So in a way that divorce risk actually made women work more and then participate more in the labor market. So this is kind of a chicken and egg question, right? So we don't know which one comes first and the other. In the US research over the 1980s and 90s, there's a lot of work that was trying to both find support both for the women's independence leading to divorce probability, higher divorce risk, and as well as retreat from the marriage. And but much less work were looking at the other way around the causality. So in 2012, I have and 2015, between those years, I have published a series of papers and try to understand this chicken and egg relationship. In one of the vast literature review and meta-analysis that we have done, I found that, together with Richard Lee from Oxford University, that the evidence was tilting towards higher divorce probability, leading to more women to work rather than the other way around. And we have done that on a different paper I have done with a set of co-authors, like more causally, try to understand whether women's work has been a response to the increased divorce risk. In 1996 in Ireland, a Catholic country where divorce was illegal before, have made a referendum, and by a slim margin, Irish population voted for legalizing divorce. We used that as a cross-natural experiment in the subsequent paper, and then to understand whether the women who are more Catholic, more religious, they attend to church more often, and then they do donate to church and Catholic organizations more often, ended up increasing their labor supply less than the women who perceive themselves not so religious. So now, under the new law, after the legalization of divorce, found their marriages less protective, ended up increasing their work more so. So in this design analysis, we followed approximately about 6,000 Irish families altogether, and then looked at the rates of divorce among the women who were religious compared to non-religious after the legalization of divorce were dramatically different. So non-religious women ended up divorcing more when the legalization, like when the law passed, and religious women did not divorce as to the same degree. And then we can compare these two groups' outcomes in terms of which women did work. And we found that the women who were less religious, therefore more likely to divorce, ended up on average working more hours. And evidence that we used to argue that the actual women's work hours is a response to something that is beyond their control, a higher divorce risk environment. So to sum up, divorce and separation and women's work is also quite a big literature. And that literature has found that increasingly when we come to post-2000s and recent marriages, they happen between men and women with more and more similar work attachment and career aspirations. Later marriages formed on the basis of similarity of their consumption and as well as their work and attachment and career behavior, what economists call consumption complementarities, are less likely to break up. And this also implies that the gender equality within the household in terms of how much market work has been done, I'm not talking much yet about the household work, domestic work, increasingly act like a stabilizer of the marriages. Although there is some evidence that varies greatly by context across the European countries, such as countries in Scandinavia, this is stronger. So the marriages that are more equal based on more gender equality are less likely to break up in Scandinavia, but it's not as strong or sometimes reversed in the Southern European countries, such as Italy and other contexts. So there is this selection into marriages, selection into divorce based on tastes and career aspirations and women's work, which may act as a protective factor for divorce later on, and something to be kept in mind when we were discussing women's work and marriages. I'll put this aside for the moment and then move on to the part 3 of my talk today, which is about policies on fathers and fathers' involvement. First of all, you may say, why should fathers get involved in childcare? It may be an obvious question for many of us here. And after all, we are all in the modern world that we love our children. We want to spend more time with our children and get involved in their growing up and experience that as a father. So there's this beauty element to it. But there are many other reasons that are slightly indirect and related to what I have been discussing up until now. The first one is a father's involvement is important for enhancing gender equality within the household, which ends up stabilizing the marriages, which is a protective factor for marriages. There's ample evidence about it. I haven't cited here. And gender equality, because we talk about gender equality because childcare is not always pleasurable. Childcare is considered to be one of the tasks that we do in the household. Although we get pleasure out of it, there's this discussion about how much of it is actually pleasurable, how much of it is actually a burden, both cognitively and physically. Given that a component of childcare is a housework that's not always pleasurable leisure activity, sharing that with women, like for men, enhances both gender equality within the household, and also helps protecting the marriages to stabilize for other indirect reasons. Because in the absence of that, childbirth has disproportionate costs on mothers' careers, and this is very well documented across the advanced economies. I'm going to show a bunch of slides afterwards, and some of this cost is actually avoidable. And another effect of father's early involvement in children, which is a protective factor against divorce and marital breakup, but as well as it's a factor that enables further contact even if divorce happens after divorce, and contact improves many of the child outcomes. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to get into this detail, but I have done multiple research for the Ministry of Justice in the UK to see how much parental contact and later court involvement helps for the children's various outcomes, including educational, cognitive, and non-cognitive outcomes, and behavioral, social, socio-emotional behavioral outcomes, and so on. So I'm not going to get into detail of that, but I'm going to be talking a bit more about why childbirth has disproportionate cost on mothers' careers, mothers' work, and some of that cost is avoidable because it doesn't have to be gendered. My colleagues at the LSE, Camille Lande and Helen Cleven and Sogart, have published this influential paper that was very much covered in the media a couple of years ago, that showed even in a country like Denmark, where there's a lot of gender equality, where there are a lot of policies that are enhancing and stressing gender equality compared to many other countries, they showed in two graphs very, very clearly that the earnings gap between men and women after the first childbirth was dramatically high, and that was long lasting and never recovering. So in panel B, you see male, two groups of men are compared, men who have children versus men who don't. On average, their earnings across, around the childbirth, before and after, are following the same trajectory. Whereas on panel A, you see women who have children compared to women who don't. There's a dramatic gap after the childbirth. That gap has never been closed over time. So this is used as an evidence that vast majority of the earnings gap we observe between men and women in the labor market, apart from horizontal segregation that they're doing different jobs and so on, are due to the fact that the childbirth is a big hit, big shock on women's careers, and it has a persistent effect on the very long run. Even after 10 years after the first birth, that shock is not recovered. In a follow-up study, my colleague Vida Marlane at Cornell University and I have looked at the US data sets to understand differences between mothers who do more child investment in the first years of the children compared to less child investments, and then see whether that gap has been closed. So we looked at two different types of child investment, and on a national longitudinal study of youth data, where we have approximately 12,000 cohort members, but around 2,000 mothers that we can look at their first birth in the data sets. What we found in this large sample data set is one of the child investment is about long breastfeeding, which can only be done by moms, and not exclusive, but long breastfeeding, and reading daily to the children between the ages 2 to 4, 3 to 5 years old, which can be done both mom or dad. So the activities are not necessarily gendered. What we find that is the mothers who do the child investments, the longest amount of breastfeeding, as well as reading every day to their children, have the largest work penalties. And these child investment activities, each of them have independent and additional effects on their work hours and likelihood of employment, and and weekly employment and so on, and then risk of unemployment as well. So we look at a large set of labor market outcomes, and we find these outcomes quite persistent across different measures too. And we find these gaps have been continuing throughout the 10 years, even after the childbirth has been completed. So this is given us quite a good evidence that some of these things, like what is it about childbirth that makes women be set on a very different trajectory in terms of earnings over their life course, is the investment burden on the children, that is reading, breastfeeding, taking care of, because we know that actually childcare takes time. We do have these two proxies, but then they're representing a whole set of other investments around the women, which ends up having them on a very different trajectory slope over their life course in terms of earnings and career outcomes. So another, one then steps back and thinks about all of these issues. We know that the women's childbirth presents a big hit, big shock to women's career, and it's because mostly it's a burden that ends up getting time investment intensive, it's time intensive as well as scheduling intensive, and it adds to the mental burden of women. So there are policies to think about whether that burden could be shared with men and the fathers better. So some family policies may help, not all of them, because family policies are actually an umbrella term to look at a whole set of policies that may be gender, some of them gender neutral, and some of them may be in favor or against women and women's careers. But one specific family policies have been shown over and over to help for getting fathers involved in the childcare early on with the children, and has long-lasting effects on various outcomes of women. So this policy that I'm talking about is called father quotas, and these are use it or lose it type of parental leave policies that are implemented in a number of countries. I think the number are increasing. They're in Norway, Austria, and Denmark, and they're in I think South Korea is trying to implement that as well, if I'm not wrong. So in a number of countries that are implementing these policies where the father-only parental leave policies, if fathers don't take it, they lose the right, that they are non-transferable to wife, that there's no negotiation between husbands and wives about who's going to take the parental leave. It's just quoted to the fathers. So one of these policies were implemented in Quebec, Canada in 2006. And my co-author, Alison Donachik at UPenn, and myself have gathered the Canadian labor force surveys and then tried to compare the women in Quebec of the same age, of the same characteristics, compared to the women who are living in the adjacent state, Ontario. And we followed their career trajectories 5 years before and 5 years after the father quota policy had implemented. And we look at these women, their childbirth around the time that they're eligible for the father quotas policies. And we documented that in the study that in Quebec, after the policy, the mothers whose husbands took advantage of the father quota policies have increased labor force participation, increased work hours, increased employment probabilities, and we found a reduced unemployment risk. Similar evidence have been found in Norway and Austria and Denmark, although magnitudes of these effects have been changing across these countries. There are other studies have looked at the Canadian policy to look at other outcomes, not only their work and labor supply behavior, but they looked at the household division of labor by looking at the time use data sets, who does more work at home. And then they also analyze whether there's increased child involvement at later stages. All of these studies have found consistently that father quotas policies have some effect, even though the size of these effects vary across countries, have improved the gender division of labor within the household, improved women's work and career outcomes. In Canada, we found that these improvements were not lasting long, but in the first 4 years of the children, and that might have a longer term effects, but we needed longitudinal data sets to follow up these women further. And but in other countries, that these effects have been found quite persistently improving women to be in a better trajectory. So we do think that in general, we can advocate policies like parental leave policies to sort some of the negative impact of childbirth and around the childcare time by incentivizing fathers to take up more of the parental leave and get involved with the children as early as possible. If I want to sum up the talk today, one of the things that we see at the very beginning is that children today increasingly experience parental separation, like especially in the Estonian setting, that the parental separation and parental breakup involve more children, more so than many other countries where the parental separation happens before the childbirth. Even though there is evidence of adverse effects of parental separation, the evidence needs to be taken with a grain of salt. We need actually more and better evidence from European countries with better data sets. And there's a lot of issues in terms of like right comparison, who we can compare and how we can make the comparison when it comes to children's well-being. Stakes are quite high. So one other call is basically we need better high frequency longitudinal cohort-based data sets to understand some of these comparisons to be more soundly done on samples that are getting increasingly diverse. And we also found that in the previous research that women's career did not increase much the divorce risk, unlike what the studies have been in the 1990s and 80s led us to believe. What was more likely happening is that in the evidence of increased divorce risk, increased more women to participate in labor force. There are other reasons why women's labor force participation and career orientation has increased, of course, including expansion in higher education and contraceptive availability and other things and so on. But one of the factors that have led women to stay on focus on their careers and future career orientation is to understand that in a high risk divorce and high divorce risk environment, the marriage ceases to be a risk insuring institution. And there's also small evidence that there's some retreat from the marriage, although I don't think that this evidence is applicable in Estonian setting where the marriage rates are comparatively higher than other countries around. Yet after childbirth, once they're in the marriage or in cohabitation, almost in every country, including Estonia, I'm sure, I haven't seen the estimates, women's career receive a big hit. And we call the motherhood penalty. The size of the penalty varies across country to country, but even in Denmark, my colleagues have found very sizable labor supply penalty and an earnings penalty. And this is attributed to basically the childbirth and the child investments around the childbirth in the first 2 or 3 years of the children, or maybe up to 5 years of children, which is disproportionately done by women. And we argue that there's some policies that encourage men to get involved with childcare, help women stabilize marriages and enhance contact with children in broken marriages. And this is where I finish. And I want to say thank you so much for listening to me. And I wish you a great conference experience in the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Dr. Berkay Özcan. This is Merle. I'm a moderator. Thank you for a comprehensive presentation that raised a lot of questions. And what a pity that we have such a limited time.
I know. I'm sorry. Not being able to be there in person and then make it a distance. Yeah.
But we have time for 2 questions and answers. The first is very intriguing for me personally as well. It's about daddy's quotas. Many countries use them. And just to explain to audience that they understand that term, it is the time of parental leave set for father to stay home with baby for multiple weeks or months, and usually is taken at the end of parental leave. So in Estonia, both parents can take the leave, but don't have to. Usually mothers take it. Would you suggest daddy's quota for Estonians?
I would. Thank you so much. Estonia is one of those countries that follows the patterns of a lot of Scandinavian countries, actually, in terms of marriage and cohabitation. I've seen the questions in the chat, whether the cohabitation and marriage patterns are different and so on. So I can say confidently that Scandinavian area in general, which I can include confidently, Estonia is into that area in terms of marriage and family regimes, where equal sharing and parental leave quotas are quite easily applicable. The reasons why are like, first, the children are involved in the marriage, like in the divorce and separations at a much higher rate in Estonia. And also, like, this is a kind of a protective measure that was sold in conservative places and before in Quebec, in South Korea, and so on, by the conservative politicians as something that is protective. So for politically, it was easier to sell. And at the same time, it enhances gender equality for settings where gender inequality was not too bad. Estonia is one of one of the front runners in other indicators of gender equality in labor market. So I would definitely recommend it. For another reason too, so parental leave quotas have been heavily evaluated in the last 5-6 years, whether they're working fine for various different outcomes, whether they're allowing women to improve their careers. This is a project that we've done in the Quebec, but they're also allowing, like, people are also testing other outcomes of women's well-being, psychological well-being, where children's relationship with parents, whether household chores distributed more evenly, whether happiness has increased. So multiple dimensions of well-being has been analyzed under the parental leave quotas, and they, on average, most of these parental leave quotas for fathers have been working in the positive direction. The sizes of these effectiveness vary. Some countries find the effects are small, some countries find large, but we haven't seen any detrimental effect of father quotas, and we have seen more likely, on average, positive effects on various dimensions of well-being and welfare. So I would recommend it to Estonian government actually implement such a policy. Yeah. One thing that I must say that, like, if Estonians are not taken up on the parental leave in the existing scheme, it's because it's gendered and negotiated within the home. The father quotas are designed to break that negotiation and oblige the fathers to get involved with the children in early ages. Yeah.
Thank you. As I'm an editor of Mothering magazine as well, then I have just a small obstacle with this idea. I have questions about breastfeeding, how it influences breastfeeding.
So it's a good question. So I'm a husband of a long breastfeeder mom at home. I have two daughters, and my wife breastfed them until the 2 years and 3 months, each of them. So, and she's a scientist in a very male-dominated environment, a career-oriented woman, as an academic as well. So I should also put all of that out. So the breastfeeding, after 6 months, the scheduling demands gets reduced, as you know better than anyone else, I'm sure. So, like, there's a whole array of things that needs to be adjusted around the workplaces about pumping and breastfeeding and extracting milk in different schedule time. But the needing or demand for breastfeeding is past the 6 months. In most countries where father quotas are implemented, like Quebec, they are tagged along after the 6th month, in Denmark as well, so that women can get back to work after 6th to 7th month of their maternity leave, and then fathers can take the turn, where the breastfeeding scheduling demands can be only done in the morning and in the afternoon, and then once a day pump during the day if the workplaces are allowed. So this is in practice that we see. And in most places where we see that this is being implemented, only about 30% of mothers actually exceeding the 6th month or 7th month of breastfeeding anyway. So the large majority of women end up stopping or ceasing to breastfeed after the 6th month, which is the UK's recommended policy. It's not universally accepted, and there's quite a lot of debate and controversy about it. But I hear you. So the policy is usually tagged along the 6-month period, and then that allows some sort of scheduling conflict to be resolved.
Thank you, Dr. Berkay Özcan. Thank you. And have a
nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.